The worn leather Bible hit the floorboards of the Dusty Creek Sheriff's office with a sound like a gunshot, and every man in the room went completely still. Theresa Kingsley stood in the doorway, her chest heaving, her dark eyes fixed on Arthur Holloway with an expression that could have stripped the bark clean off a pine tree. Her traveling dress was dusty from the road, her hair half fallen from its pins, and in her trembling right hand she held the small tintype photograph that had just slipped free from between the pages of that Bible when the book had fallen from her saddlebag onto the deputy's desk. It was her own face staring back at her from that photograph. Her face, her image. The portrait she had sat for in St. Louis nearly 3 years ago, when she had been 19 years old and filled with nothing but bright and dangerous hope. Arthur Holloway had not moved from his chair behind the sheriff's desk. He was a large, broad-shouldered man with sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair gone slightly silver at the temples, and he was watching her with those steady gray eyes of his in a way that made her feel as though the floor were slowly tilting beneath her boots. Nobody in this town knew. Nobody in Dusty Creek, Texas had known that the man they called Sheriff Holloway, the man they trusted with their lives and their livelihoods, had kept her photograph inside his worn leather Bible. Not Deputy Crane, who was currently pretending to study something very interesting on the wall to his left. Not Mrs. Albright at the boarding house. Not old Reverend Marsh. Nobody. And the worst of it, the thing that made Theresa's throat close tight around whatever words she had intended to say, was that she had never sent him that photograph. She had never sent it to anyone. It had been sitting in her late mother's vanity drawer in St. Louis until 3 weeks ago, when her mother died and left Theresa with nothing but debt, a drafty rented house, and a locked tin box full of letters she had never seen before. Letters in a strong, slanted handwriting. Letters addressed not to her, but to her mother. Letters signed with a name she had not recognized at first, not until she read the third one and understood, with a cold and creeping horror, exactly what had been arranged without her knowledge. Her mother had been corresponding with Arthur Holloway for 2.5 years. Her mother had sent him that photograph. Her mother had, in effect, sold her daughter to a man she had never met, in a town she had never heard of, in exchange for a sum of money that had kept their household running through 2 hard winters and a bad harvest year. Theresa had ridden 400 miles in 3 weeks with a dark past pressing at her back, and a betrayal so deep it had cracked something fundamental inside her chest. And now, she was standing in this dusty little sheriff's office in Dusty Creek, Texas in September of 1878, holding her own face in her hand, and looking at the man who had kept her secret for years without ever once writing to her directly. She found her voice finally. It came out quieter than she had intended, which somehow made it more dangerous. "How long," she said, "have you had this?" Arthur Holloway said nothing for 3 full seconds. Then he rose from his chair very slowly, the way a man moves when he is trying very hard not to startle something wild. "Miss Kingsley," he said. "How long, Mr. Holloway?" The silence between them was thick enough to choke on, and that was where everything truly began. 3 years earlier, in the spring of 1875, Theresa Kingsley had been 19 years old and living in a rented house on Elm Street in St. Louis, Missouri, with her mother, Margaret Kingsley, who had once been a beautiful woman and was now a frightened one. Margaret had come west from Virginia as a young bride, buried her husband in a cholera epidemic when Theresa was 11, and spent the subsequent 8 years doing everything a woman alone could legally do in 1875 to keep her daughter fed and clothed and educated. She had taken in mending. She had given piano lessons to the daughters of merchant families. She had quietly sold off her husband's books and his silver pocket watch, and finally, in a moment of desperation so private it had never once been spoken aloud, she had written a letter. She had written to a man named Arthur Holloway, whose name she had found in a notice posted in the St. Louis Dispatch. The notice had been placed by a land agent in Texas, advertising for respectable families and settlers to come south and build a future in the expanding territory of Central Texas. But Margaret Kingsley had not been looking to move. She had been looking at the name printed alongside that notice as co-signatory, the name of the man who owned the largest cattle ranch in the county south of San Antonio, the man who had reportedly single-handedly funded the construction of Dusty Creek's first proper church and its first school. She had written to him not as a settler, but as a mother. She had explained her situation with a dignity that had cost her enormously to maintain. She had asked plainly whether a man of his standing and financial security might be in the market for a wife, and she had included in that letter a description of her daughter that was loving and honest and also deeply, unforgivably calculated. She had not told Theresa. She had told herself that she would tell Theresa when something concrete came of it. She had told herself that she would explain everything properly when there was something good to report, something hopeful, something that would make the arrangement sound like an opportunity rather than a transaction. Arthur Holloway had written back. He had been 28 years old that spring, and he was a man who had built everything he owned with his own hands from a land grant he had received after 3 years of service with the United States Army in the campaigns following the Civil War. He had fought in those campaigns without glory and without particular belief in their justness, and he had come home to Texas with a limp that lasted 2 years and a quietness that lasted considerably longer. And he had turned that land grant into a working cattle operation through 7 years of very hard, very solitary work. He was, by the spring of 1875, a man of means and no particular hope of a different kind of life. The women in Dusty Creek were all spoken for, and he was not the kind of man who went looking. He worked. He built things. He attended church on Sundays because Reverend Marsh was a good man who said useful things, and he had a leather Bible that his mother had given him the day he left Virginia for the Army, and he read from it most evenings by firelight because the words gave the silence some company. When he received Margaret Kingsley's letter, he read it 3 times. He was not a man who acted quickly on matters of feeling. He was, his foreman Caleb Wade always said, the kind of man who would spend a week deciding whether to replace a fence post, and then do it perfectly and never have to do it again. So he had sat with that letter for a full week before he wrote back. His reply had been careful and honest and more revealing than he perhaps intended. He had explained that he was not opposed to the idea of a wife, but that he was not willing to enter into any arrangement that the woman herself had not freely agreed to. He had written that he was not in the habit of acquiring things, and that a woman was not a thing to be acquired. He had been quite direct about his circumstances and his character and his limitations. He had ended the letter by saying that if Miss Kingsley was the kind of woman her mother described, then he would be honored to correspond with her directly, but only if she wished to do so of her own will. Margaret Kingsley had read that reply and wept a little and then made the worst decision of her life. She had decided not to tell Theresa yet. She had told herself she needed to know more about him first. She had told herself she was protecting her daughter. And so she had written back to Arthur Holloway herself, pretending, not in so many words but in the general shape of the correspondence, that she was conveying her daughter's responses. She had sent him the tintype photograph. She had described Theresa's opinions and preferences and hopes in terms that were mostly accurate, because Margaret knew her daughter well, but they were Theresa's opinions filtered through Margaret's fear and Margaret's hope and Margaret's desperate need for this to work. Arthur Holloway, reading these letters in his ranch house by firelight, had fallen in love, not with a phantom, not with a fiction. He had fallen in love with the woman he believed was writing to him, the woman whose photograph he had placed carefully inside his Bible, between Psalms and Proverbs, in a place where he would see her every evening. He had fallen in love with her sharp wit and her refusal to be sentimental about hard things, with her opinions on books and her direct questions about the ranch, and whether the soil in Central Texas would support a kitchen garden. He had fallen in love with the particular quality of her curiosity, which arrived in each letter like a bright light coming around a corner, and every word he had been responding to had been written by her mother. For 2.5 years this had continued. Margaret Kingsley had kept the money Arthur Holloway sent for travel expenses, money sent against the day when Theresa would come to Texas to be properly courted, and she had spent it on rent and winter coal and Theresa's new dress for the Hartley family's Christmas party. She had kept the letters hidden in the locked tin box. She had told herself every month that next month she would explain. Next month she would sit Theresa down and tell her about this kind, steady man who was waiting for her in Texas. Next month. And then Margaret Kingsley had died in August of 1878 from a fever that took her quickly and without warning, and the locked tin box had been waiting in the vanity drawer. Theresa had found it on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 days after the funeral, while she was sorting through her mother's things in a grief so raw it felt like weather. She had broken the lock with a kitchen knife. She had sat on the edge of her mother's bed and read every single letter, all 47 of them, over the course of 4 hours, while outside the window the summer light slowly died and the street lamps came on one by one. By the end of the 4th hour, she had understood several things with absolute clarity. She understood that her mother had loved her enough to do something profoundly wrong for her sake. She understood that a man named Arthur Holloway believed himself to be in a courtship with a woman he had never met. She understood that he had been sending money for travel expenses for 2 years, money that was, technically, owed back to him. And she understood, in a way she could not quite account for and was not sure she wanted to examine, that the man who had written those 47 letters was one of the most remarkable people she had never encountered, because she had read his letters too. Margaret had saved his letters right alongside her own fabricated replies, and Theresa had read every one of them, and they were extraordinary in their plainness. He did not write with flourish. He did not perform. He wrote about the ranch and the cattle and the land with the same directness he seemed to bring to everything, and woven through those practical descriptions were these moments of such quiet, startling honesty that Theresa had found herself sitting very still and reading certain passages twice, 3 times. He had written once about watching a thunderstorm roll across the plains from his front porch and feeling, for the first time in a long while, that the vastness of the country was not a lonely thing but a generous one, because there was so much of it and it did not ask anything of you in return for the view. He had written about missing his mother, who had died in 1872, with a simplicity that had made Theresa's own grief for her mother rise up and press against the inside of her ribs. He had written, in the most recent letter dated July of 1878, that he had been thinking about the autumn and hoping very much that Theresa might consider making the journey to Texas before winter closed the roads. He had written that he was aware this required a great deal of trust on her part, and that he did not take the weight of that lightly. He had written, at the very end, in a sentence so careful and so transparent in its restraint that it nearly broke her, "I find that I have grown quite accustomed to the particular company of your letters, and I would very much like to grow accustomed to the particular company of the person herself." Theresa had put that letter down and stared at the dark window for a very long time. Then she had packed a trunk, booked passage on the southbound train to San Antonio, and spent 18 days traveling to Dusty Creek with a head full of fury and a heart in a condition she could not yet name. She had arrived on a Thursday morning in late September 1878, and she had gone first to the boarding house. And then, when she could not stand to wait another hour, she had walked straight to the sheriff's office, because one of the letters had mentioned that Arthur Holloway served as the county sheriff alongside running his ranch, and she had known somehow that if she was going to do this at all she needed to do it directly, face to face, before her courage ran out. She had not planned for the Bible to fall out of her saddlebag. She had not planned for the photograph to be there. She had not planned for the look on his face when he rose from that chair. Now, standing in the sheriff's office with the photograph in her hand and the afternoon light slanting through the dusty window, Theresa looked at Arthur Holloway and waited for him to either confirm or deny what she already knew. He walked around the desk. He moved in that measured way of his, deliberate and unhurried, and he stopped about 4 feet from her, which was exactly the right distance, she thought, for a man who understood that she might bolt like a frightened horse and was choosing not to crowd her. He said, "Your mother sent it in the spring of 1875, with her first letter." His voice was low and even and held something in it she had not expected. Not guilt exactly. Something more complicated. Something that looked from the inside, she suspected, like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just been asked to set it down. Theresa said, "You knew. At some point you must have known that you were not corresponding with me." He looked at her steadily. "I suspected," he said, "about 8 months in. The handwriting was consistent, but the voice was not always. There were letters where I could feel it shifting. And you kept corresponding anyway." "Yes. Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because whoever was writing those letters, the woman at the center of them was real. The opinions were real. The questions were real. And I thought if I waited long enough, if I gave it enough time, the truth would sort itself out." Theresa looked at him for a long moment, and something moved in her chest that she immediately refused to acknowledge. "That is either the most patient thing I have ever heard or the most foolish," she said. "Possibly both," he agreed. She looked down at the photograph in her hand. Her own young face looked back at her. 19 years old and not yet aware of everything that was coming. Everything that would be arranged without her consent in quiet rooms, while she sat at the kitchen table and did her sewing and trusted the world to be what it appeared to be. She said, "She is dead, Mr. Holloway. My mother died in August." Something changed in his face, not dramatically, just a slight shift in those steady gray eyes, a recognition of weight. "I am sorry," he said, and he meant it, she could tell. She had become very good at knowing when people meant things. She said, "She kept the travel money. I know she did. I intend to repay it." He said, "Miss Kingsley." "I will repay it," she said firmly. "I don't know how yet, since I have very little money and no occupation and no particular plan, but the debt is real and I intend to honor it." "There is no debt," he said. "There is," she said. "And the fact that you don't want to collect on it doesn't make it disappear. I am not in the habit of carrying obligations I cannot name." He looked at her for a moment, and she thought she saw something that might, in different lighting, be the beginning of a smile. Not an amused smile. Something warmer and more private than that. He said, "Would you like to sit down?" She considered this for a moment. She was, in truth, exhausted. 18 days of travel and 3 weeks of grief, and the particular bone-deep tiredness of having ridden the last 30 miles on a rented horse that did not care for her either. She sat down. He sat in the other chair, angled toward her rather than behind the desk, which she noticed, and Deputy Crane found a pressing reason to be elsewhere, which she also noticed. They sat in the slanting afternoon light of the Dusty Creek Sheriff's Office, and Theresa Kingsley said, "Tell me what you actually know about me then. From those letters, tell me what you think you know." It was a test. She recognized it as a test even as she offered it. Arthur Holloway did not hesitate. "You are 22, he said. "You prefer October to all other months because the light is better. You have read David Copperfield 3 times and think Dickens is inconsistent but forgive him for it. You are not afraid of hard work, but you are afraid of being useless. You believe in fairness to a degree that sometimes makes your life harder than it needs to be. You have a temper that you keep on a fairly tight rein, and then every once in a while it gets entirely away from you." She stared at him. "You want a kitchen garden," he continued. "You want to keep chickens. You are not sure about cattle, but you are willing to learn. You do not want anyone to make decisions for you without your knowledge. You think people who are dishonest with each other because they're trying to be kind are doing a kind of harm that doesn't have a good name. The last one landed somewhere tender." She said quietly, "And is any of that wrong?" "I don't know yet," he said. "I only just met you." She looked at him for a long time. He looked back. The afternoon light moved very slowly across the floorboards between them. She said, "I read your letters too." Something happened in his face then. Something shifted and steadied at the same time, like a man who had been braced for a blow and had received instead a reprieve. She said, "All 47 of them." He said, "Then we are in roughly the same position." "Roughly," she agreed, "with the small difference that you knew me, however imperfectly, and I did not know you at all until 3 weeks ago." "That is not a small difference," he said. "No," she agreed, "it is not." They sat with that truth for a moment, letting it occupy the space between them without trying to fill it. She said, "I'm not here to hold you to any arrangement my mother made. I want to be clear about that. Whatever she promised you, whatever she implied, I am not that. I am my own person and I make my own choices." "I know that," he said. "Then we understand each other." "We are beginning to," he said. She left the sheriff's office 20 minutes later and walked back to the boarding house, and she lay on the narrow bed in her rented room and stared at the cracked plaster ceiling and thought about a man with steady gray eyes and a worn leather Bible, and she was annoyed to discover that she was not, in fact, as angry as she had expected to be. She was angry at her mother, yes, with a grief-complicated anger that she suspected would take years to fully unravel. She was angry at the situation, at the hidden arrangement, at the way her own life had been partly built on a fiction she had not consented to. But she was not angry at him. She was not entirely sure what she was regarding him. Wary, certainly. Curious, certainly. And there was something else underneath both of those, something she refused to look at directly for now, the way you do not look directly at the sun even when you are intensely aware of its presence. She slept and dreamed of a kitchen garden in Texas soil, and woke before dawn with the absolute conviction that she was going to stay in Dusty Creek for at least a little while. The town of Dusty Creek in the fall of 1878 was a place in the process of becoming. It had about 300 permanent residents, a main street with 6 businesses including the general store run by a man named Hector Delgado and his wife Paulina, a land office, a hardware store, a saloon called the Painted Pony that was less rowdy than its name suggested, a church, and a school that had been built the previous spring. There was a telegraph office that had been operational for 2 years, connecting Dusty Creek to San Antonio and from there to the wider world. It was a town that had been carved out of the central Texas plains with enormous difficulty and a great deal of hope, and it showed both in equal measure. Theresa spent her first week in Dusty Creek in a state of careful observation. She was good at watching. She always had been, from years of sitting quietly while adults talked around her and absorbing everything they thought she was too young or too female to understand. She watched the rhythms of the town and the people in it, and she came to understand several things quite quickly. She understood that Arthur Holloway was not merely liked in this town, but respected in a way that was deep and specific, the kind of respect you cannot purchase or perform, the kind that accretes around a person over years of doing difficult things correctly. She understood that he had used his own money to fund the school. She understood that he had negotiated, through considerable personal effort and some political courage, a peaceful arrangement with a Comanche band that had previously raided along the eastern edge of the county, an arrangement that had held for 4 years and saved lives on both sides. She understood that he had personally ridden 40 miles into a dust storm to bring back a 14-year-old girl who had run away from home after her stepfather had raised his hand to her, and that he had subsequently made very clear to the stepfather that this would not happen again, in terms that had apparently been both quiet and absolute. She understood all of this not because Arthur Holloway told her any of it. He was, she was discovering, constitutionally incapable of talking about himself in any favorable light, but because Mrs. Paulina Delgado at the general store talked, and Deputy Crane talked when he'd had a cup of coffee, and old Reverend Marsh talked during the Thursday sewing circle that Theresa inexplicably found herself attending by the end of her first week. By her second week, she had begun to find her footing in the town. She had gone to the school and introduced herself to the teacher, a young woman named Clara Bright from Ohio, who was doing a heroic job with 30 children and not enough books, and she had offered to help on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. Clara Bright had looked at her with the expression of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been offered a second pair of hands. She had helped Hector Delgado's wife organize the stock room one afternoon in exchange for credit at the store, because her funds were not going to last indefinitely. She had started the kitchen garden, or the beginning of one, in the small yard behind the boarding house, with Mrs. Albright's bemused permission. It was the wrong time of year for most things, but she planted winter onions and garlic, and she had found, in the process of turning the soil, that there was something very useful about putting her hands in the earth. She had not, in those 2 weeks, had another private conversation with Arthur Holloway. She had seen him. Dusty Creek was small enough that avoiding anyone was essentially impossible, and she had not been trying to avoid him exactly. She had simply been using the time to think. They had exchanged greetings on Main Street twice. He had tipped his hat to her outside the church on Sunday with an expression of such careful neutrality that she had found it almost funny. He was, she was learning, a man who was very good at waiting. She was not, by nature, a woman who was good at waiting. On the Saturday of her second week in Dusty Creek, she put on her second-best dress, the dark blue one that she privately thought was more flattering than the best one, and she walked out to the Holloway ranch. It was about 2 miles east of town, and the walk gave her time to reconsider, which she used to firm her resolve rather than reverse it. The ranch sat against a low rise in the land, the main house a long, low structure of cedar wood and limestone with a covered porch running the full length of the front, 2 large live oak trees in the yard, and behind it the barn and the bunkhouse and the corrals, everything solid and well-maintained, and bearing the particular character of a place that has been cared for by the same person for a long time. Arthur Holloway was on the porch when she came up the road. He was reading a book, which she found obscurely very satisfying. He saw her coming from some distance away, because the land was flat enough that you could see a long way, and by the time she reached the gate he had closed the book and stood up and was watching her approach with those steady gray eyes and that careful expression. She opened the gate, walked up the path, and said, "I thought we should talk properly." "Yes," he said. He held the door and she went inside. The interior of the house was, she discovered, almost startling in its order and its particular kind of beauty. Not decorative beauty, but the beauty of a space that has been thought about, that has been arranged with intention. There were bookshelves built into the wall of the main room, full of books that had clearly been read. There was a table of good oak wood with 4 chairs, which suggested an optimism about future company. There was a stone fireplace, and above it, instead of a mounted animal head, a painting of the Texas plains in one of those golden evening lights that seemed to belong to a different world than the harsh noon of summer. She looked at the painting for a long moment. "My mother painted that," he said from behind her. "From memory, she never came to Texas, but I described it to her in a letter and she sent this back." Theresa turned and looked at him and said nothing. He had put a coffee pot on, she noticed. He had also put out a small plate of shortbread biscuits that had clearly been acquired in advance, which told her he had been expecting something like this visit, or hoping for it, or both. They sat at the oak table with their coffee and the afternoon sun coming through the window, and Theresa said, "I want to propose something." He waited. She said, "I need a reason to stay in this town. I have very little money, I have no family, and I have no obligation to be here except the one I made up for myself about the debt, which you insist doesn't exist. So let me make you an honest proposal." He looked at her without expression, which she had learned was simply how he listened. Fully, without the usual social performance of listening, she said, "I would like to be courted, properly, on my own terms, not on the terms my mother arranged, not on the terms of that correspondence that I had no part in but from the beginning. You and me as ourselves in the actual world with no intermediary." Something changed in his face. It was very slight, and it was very clearly an effort to contain something larger. She said, "I am not promising anything. I am not committing to anything. I am saying that I read your letters, and I have been in this town for 2 weeks, and I have heard a great many things about you, and none of them have made me want to leave faster. And I think you are owed the chance to actually meet me. And I think," she said, and this last part cost her something, "I might be owed the same." He said, "Yes, just that. Yes." She said, "Good. Then we will start from here, from today, and we will not pretend the letters happened, and we will not pretend they didn't." "Agreed," he said. "And you will stop looking at me like you're waiting for me to disappear," she said. He blinked. "You do it," she said. "That particular quality of stillness when you look at me. Like you are fixing the image in case it doesn't last. It is very disconcerting." A pause. And then for the first time she saw a real smile on Arthur Holloway's face. Not a polite smile or a professional smile, but the other kind, the kind that goes all the way up to the eyes and changes the whole character of a face. It transformed him. It made him look younger and warmer and somehow more dangerous in the best possible way. He said, "I will try," she said. "See that you do." She drank her coffee and ate 2 of the shortbread biscuits, and they talked for 2 hours, easily and with a strange lack of effort, about his ranch and her ideas about the kitchen garden and Dickens, and the painting and the coming winter, and whether the soil in Central Texas would in fact support root vegetables. It was the most comfortable conversation she had had with anyone since before her mother got sick, and she walked back to town in the violet dusk, feeling something she could only describe as the structural opposite of lonely. What followed was a courtship conducted in full view of Dusty Creek, which had opinions about it. Mrs. Albright at the boarding house was cautiously supportive, but felt that Theresa needed a chaperone for visits to the ranch. A suggestion Theresa received with the politeness of a woman who was 22 years old and had ridden 400 miles alone, and was not about to let anyone else manage her virtue on her behalf. Hector Delgado told his wife Paulina that it was about time, that Arthur Holloway had been lonely for years even if he never admitted it, and that the young woman from St. Louis seemed like she had the spine for this country. Deputy Crane, who had witnessed the opening scene of this drama, kept his own counsel and was rewarded for this discretion by finding, periodically, small gifts of good coffee left on his desk, which he attributed to no one in particular and appreciated enormously. Reverend Marsh said a private prayer of thanks and then minded his business, which is the pastoral ideal. Arthur and Theresa fell into a rhythm that felt, to both of them, like something that had been waiting a long time to exist. He came to town on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons when she was teaching at the school, and would sometimes sit in the back of the room and watch her work, not in a manner that could be called hovering, but in the manner of a man watching something impressive being done well. She came to the ranch on Saturday mornings, and they worked side by side. She was learning the operation of the place, and he was learning that her ideas about efficiency were frequently correct and always worth hearing. She was, he discovered in stages that were each a small revelation, exactly as sharp and direct as the letters had suggested, and nothing like what the letters had managed to convey about the particular quality of her presence. She was funny, with a dry humor that caught him off guard regularly and left him more delighted each time. She was fierce about fairness in a way that was not theoretical but practical and immediate. She had already, by the end of her 3rd week in Dusty Creek, had a clear and direct conversation with a man named Briggs who had been paying Paulina Delgado less than the posted price for her embroidery work, because he thought she would not push back. And the conversation had been so politely devastating that Briggs had paid the full amount and left the store looking like a man who had been somehow simultaneously scolded and forgiven. She was also, he was learning, someone who carried a great deal. The grief for her mother was real and deep, and she was not always successful at keeping it from showing on her face, and on the occasions when it showed he had learned not to talk it away, but to simply be present with the weight of it, which was, she told him once, the most useful thing anyone had ever done for her regarding grief. And she was, he thought privately and at great length during the quiet evenings on the ranch, the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, not in any one particular way but in the accumulative way of everything together, her dark eyes and the way she moved and the particular angle of her chin when she had decided something, and the fact that he kept finding new specific things about her that he could not stop noticing. He thought about the photograph in the Bible. He had thought about it the morning after she first came to the sheriff's office, when he had picked up the Bible from the floor and looked at her face in that small image and understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water, that the real woman and the woman in the image were now the same woman and also an entirely different person, and he had been falling in love with one while holding the image of the other, and now they were both here, both real, both looking at him. He had not moved the photograph. He was not sure why. Perhaps because moving it would have felt like a kind of deletion of the history, even the tangled and problematic history of how he had come to know her existed. Perhaps because he was not quite ready to put down the particular hope the image had carried for him through 3 years of evenings. He told her about this one afternoon in October when they were sitting on the porch of the ranch in one of those perfect Texas autumn days, the sky a deep and specific blue and the air carrying just enough cool to make a person aware of their own skin. He said, "I still have it in there. I want you to know that." She had been looking out at the land. She turned her head and looked at him. He said, "I am not sure exactly why, but it doesn't seem right to remove it without telling you." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Don't remove it." He looked at her. She said, "It is part of how you got here. Part of how we got here. The whole of it is flawed and strange, and my mother did something I am still not entirely reconciled to. But the fact that you looked at that face every evening for 3 years and waited, I do not know what to do with that, Arthur, except to say that it is not nothing." It was the first time she had used his given name, and neither of them acknowledged it directly, but the quality of the air on the porch changed in a way that was quite noticeable. He said, quietly, "Theresa," just her name. The way a person says a word they have been waiting to say aloud for a very long time. She looked at him for a long moment, and he looked at her, and Dusty Creek was 2 miles away, and the Texas plains were running out in every direction, and there was nothing between them and the horizon but open land and open air, and the beginning of something that was exactly as large as all of that. He reached out and took her hand. She let him. They sat like that for a long time while the blue afternoon light moved across the land. November arrived, and with it the particular complications of a life being built rather than merely visited. Theresa's funds ran out at the beginning of the month, which she handled by simply telling Mrs. Albright the truth and negotiating a partial exchange of work for room and board, cleaning and helping with meals, while continuing her school work. She was not embarrassed by this. She had been managing without a safety net for most of her adult life, and she was practical about it in a way that Mrs. Albright, who had not expected such direct self-management from a woman of apparent good breeding, found both admirable and slightly intimidating. Arthur knew because she told him, because she had decided early on that the one thing this particular story absolutely could not afford was any more hidden information. He had offered money, carefully and without pressure, and she had declined it with equal care, and said that she would ask when she was ready to ask, and he would know when that was. He accepted this. He was learning to accept a great many things about Theresa Kingsley that ran counter to his initial expectations, and he was finding that most of them ran counter in an upward direction. The difficulty arrived, as difficulties tended to do in Dusty Creek, without much warning. His name was Frank Tully, and he rode into Dusty Creek on the second Tuesday in November with 3 men, and a cloud of trouble that had apparently been following him for some time. Tully was a land speculator of the aggressive variety, the kind that had been moving through central Texas for the past decade, identifying properties with water rights that their owners could be persuaded, or pressured, into selling. He had heard about the Holloway Ranch and its particularly good access to the Blanco River tributary that ran through the eastern portion of the property. He had also heard that Arthur Holloway was a man of principle, which Tully had categorized, with the confidence of a man who had never had much principle himself, as a vulnerability. He made his visit to the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon, arriving at the same time as Theresa, who had ridden out to look at the progress on a new section of winter fence with Arthur. The coincidence of timing was not accidental, she would learn later. Tully had inquired about Holloway's habits in town and had been told, by someone whose identity she never fully determined, that the sheriff was somewhat susceptible to being distracted when his lady visitor was present. Tully was a heavy man of about 50, with the kind of surface charm that was difficult to place, until you noticed that his eyes did not move with the same warmth as his smile. He made his offer for the eastern water access rights at what he presented as a generous price, seated at Arthur's oak table with a document already drawn up, and he watched Arthur Holloway's face as he made it. Arthur's face told him nothing useful. "I'm not selling," he said. Tully leaned back and spread his hands in a gesture of open reasonableness. "Mr. Holloway, I want to be direct with you. I have already acquired the Bellamy property to the north and the Garrett property to the south. Your water access is, from a development standpoint, the final necessary piece. Without it, frankly, my project has limited value. With it, this entire region benefits from the kind of investment that brings jobs and prosperity." "I'm not selling," Arthur said again. Tully's smile stayed in place, but the quality of the room changed. He said, "I was hoping we could arrive at a more mutually beneficial understanding." Theresa, who had been standing slightly to the side and observing this exchange with the sharp attention she brought to anything that felt like a threat taking its coat off, said, "What does that mean precisely?" Tully turned to look at her. His smile shifted in a way she did not like. "Miss Kingsley, isn't it? I was told you were staying in town. You must be encouraging of Mr. Holloway's better instincts." "I encourage his actual instincts," she said, "which appear to be perfectly functional." Tully looked back at Arthur. The surface charm had developed a slight edge. He said, "I'm prepared to make a very significant offer. I'm also prepared to note that land in this county has a way of being revalued when certain interests align. Property assessments, water disputes, the kind of legal questions that can tie a man's operations up for years. I would hate to see that happen." There was a silence. Theresa said calmly and clearly, "That sounds very much like a threat, Mr. Tully." "I prefer to call it a landscape assessment," Tully said. Arthur stood up from his chair. He did it slowly, the way he did everything, and the room seemed to contract slightly when he was at full height. He said, "Mr. Tully, I am going to be very plain with you. I have heard what you did to the Bellamy family. I've heard what happened to the Garretts. A man loses water access in this country, he loses everything, and you know that, which is why you buy and threaten in that order. You are not going to do that here. And if you attempt any of the legal maneuvers you are implying, I will make it my personal business to document every step of your operation in this county and submit a full account to the Land Registry Office in Austin. I have already been in correspondence with the State Attorney General's office about land acquisition methods in Central Texas. Your name has come up." Tully's smile was gone. He was looking at Arthur with an expression that had moved through surprise and was settling into something uglier. He said, "You're bluffing." Arthur picked up a folded document from the shelf beside the fireplace and held it out. Tully took it, unfolded it, and read it. Whatever it said, it was sufficient. He folded it back up, very carefully, and put it on the table and said nothing. He left 20 minutes later with his 3 men, and the sound of the horses on the road was the only sound for a little while after. Theresa said, "You were not bluffing." "No," Arthur said. "How long have you been building that case?" 8 months, he said. She looked at him. "Before I arrived." "Before you arrived," he said. She thought about that for a moment, about a man who had seen injustice coming and had quietly, methodically, begun building the instruments to stop it. Not out of dramatics, but out of the same practical care, he brought to fence posts and firelight reading and letters in a Bible. She crossed the room and she kissed him. It was, for both of them, the end of a very long and very patient exercise in restraint, and it was the beginning of something that felt like arriving somewhere you had been traveling toward for a very long time without quite knowing the name of the destination. He kissed her back with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, complete and unhurried, and she had both hands on his face, and the Texas afternoon light was falling through the window onto the oak table and the folded document that had called Frank Tully's bluff. After a while she pulled back and looked at him and said, "I think I have been in love with you since the third letter." He said, "You read my third letter and you loved me," she said. "You wrote about the thunderstorm and the vastness of the country not asking anything of you. I was sitting on my dead mother's bed reading it and I thought, who is this man?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your mother did a wrong thing. She did it for love of you and she did a wrong thing with it, but I am not able to be angry about the outcome." Theresa said, "Neither am I am working on it." "Take as long as you need," he said. "I will," she said, "but in the meantime—" She kissed him again. December came to Dusty Creek with a cold wind off the plains and a sense of things gathering toward resolution. Arthur filed his documentation with the state attorney general's office and received, within 3 weeks, an acknowledgment and a statement that Frank Tully's recent acquisitions in the county were under review. Tully left the area before Christmas and did not return, and the Bellamy and Garrett families would eventually have their water rights fairly reassessed, though that process took longer and was harder than it should have been, because the machinery of justice in 1878 Texas was imperfect and slow. But the beginning had been made, and beginnings mattered. Arthur proposed to Theresa on a Sunday morning in December, on the porch of the ranch, in the thin winter sunlight that made the whole plain look like something painted in silver and gold. He had, she discovered, spent 2 weeks talking himself into the manner of the proposal. He was a man who was specific about things, and he had thought about what he wanted to say and how he wanted to say it, and then standing on the porch, he had forgotten all of it and simply said, "Theresa, I want to ask you to marry me, and I want you to know that the answer does not change anything permanent about us except the legal arrangement. You are already the person I intend to spend my life with. I am asking because I want you to choose it explicitly for yourself with full information, because no one is ever again going to make a choice about your life without your knowledge." She had been looking out at the plains. She had turned to look at him. Her eyes were very bright in the December light. She said, "Yes, Arthur, with full information and explicit choice, and as myself. Yes." He had put a ring on her finger that had been his mother's, a simple gold band with a small garnet that caught the light, and she had looked at it on her hand for a long moment as if she were integrating something. Then she had said, "Now you can take that photograph out of the Bible if you want." He had looked at her. She said, "Or you can keep it. I told you before, but now you can choose rather than it being a question." He said, "I think I'd like to keep it." She said, "Then keep it." She reached up and touched his face the way she had touched it the first time she kissed him, both hands framing him like something she was trying to memorize. She said, "But now I'm here." "Yes," he said, "now you're here." They were married in January of 1879, in the Dusty Creek Church on a cold, bright Tuesday, by Reverend Marsh, who said the ceremony with a warmth that had a good deal of personal satisfaction in it. The whole town came, which was not a surprise, and there was a celebration afterward at the Delgado's store, which Paulina had decorated with pine boughs and winter berries with considerable artistic ambition. Theresa wore her best dress, the one she privately thought was slightly less flattering than the blue one, and it turned out not to matter at all, because she spent most of the ceremony looking at Arthur Holloway's face, and the rest of the party being told by various townspeople that she was exactly what this town needed, a statement she received with equal parts bemusement and gratitude. Deputy Crane gave them a wedding gift of a good new coffee pot, which was, Theresa told Arthur privately, the most practical and perfect wedding gift she had ever received, which, given that the previous coffee pot at the ranch had a tendency to boil over, was entirely true. Clara Bright, the school teacher, hugged Theresa very tightly outside the church and whispered that she hoped she was not going to lose her Thursday afternoons, and Theresa said she absolutely was not, which Clara received with evident relief. They rode back to the ranch in the cold January afternoon, the two of them, with Theresa's trunk loaded in the wagon behind, and the flat silver-gold light of winter going on forever in all directions, and neither of them feeling the need to fill the air with words. She had brought 3 things from St. Louis that she had kept through all the practicalities of moving. The first was her mother's painting of a garden in summer, Virginia green and specific, which she hung in the bedroom. The second was a collection of books that had been her father's, which she added to Arthur's shelves and watched them mix in with his books in a way that pleased her deeply. The third was the tin box with the letters. She put the tin box on the shelf in the study, where she could see it. She was not ready to do anything with it yet, but she had decided she was not going to hide it either. It contained the full and complicated record of how she had arrived at her life, and she was going to keep it where she could look at it, until the looking stopped being a thing that required courage. Life on the Holloway ranch in the early months of their marriage was, she discovered, a combination of the deeply practical and the entirely extraordinary. The practical. She became fluent in cattle operations with a speed that surprised Caleb Wade, the foreman, who had expected polite interest and received instead specific questions, and a genuine grasp of the economics involved. She extended the kitchen garden with great determination through February and March, turning soil that had not been cultivated before, and she found in this work the same meditative satisfaction she had found in the boarding house yard, scaled up and made her own. She learned to ride properly, which she had never had occasion to do in St. Louis, on a sorrel mare named Clara that Arthur gave her in February, and she became in time a proficient rider who loved the particular freedom of it. The extraordinary, the evenings. The evenings on the Holloway ranch had a quality she had not known existed before she lived them. The firelight and the books and Arthur's voice reading aloud when they were both too tired to do anything but listen. The conversation that moved easily from the practical to the philosophical to the personal and back again. The particular silence between two people who have become comfortable with each other's presence in the specific physical sense. The weight of him sitting next to her. The warmth. The sense of the world correctly arranged. She loved him with a depth that she had not anticipated. She had expected to love him, had chosen to come here partly on the evidence of those letters and partly on the stubbornness of her own heart, but she had not anticipated the daily accumulated weight of it. The way loving him was not a state but an activity, something that grew rather than stayed, that changed and deepened with each new thing she learned about him. She learned that he was a meticulous and unsentimental record keeper, but that he had saved every ticket stub from every train journey he had ever taken in a small envelope in his desk drawer, for no reason he could explain. She learned that he was better with sick animals than any man she had ever seen, patient and instinctive, and clearly communicating something to a frightened horse or a feverish calf that she could not quite name. She learned that he had opinions about poetry, held privately and rarely shared, that were passionate and very specific, and which delighted her entirely. She learned that he could not fall asleep in a strange bed, but could fall asleep anywhere on the ranch within minutes, which she found endearing to a degree that surprised her. She told him things about herself in stages, the way you unfold a map in sections when the whole of it at once would be overwhelming. She told him about her father, who had been a mild and curious man, an amateur botanist who had pressed flowers in books and told her the Latin names of everything in their Virginia garden, and who had left, in his brief presence and his absence, a template for the kind of attention she valued in people. She told him about the years in St. Louis after the cholera epidemic, the managed poverty and the maintained dignity, the piano lessons and the mending and the particular specific shame of being almost fine, of having enough and not quite enough in a way that no one outside the house would know. She told him about reading, the years and years of reading as a mode of escape and also of construction, of building the self she intended to be from the materials available in books, because the materials available in life were sometimes in short supply. He listened to all of it the way he listened to everything, with that complete and quiet attention, and he never tried to fix it or minimize it or convert it into something more comfortable. Once, late in March, she had been telling him something about her mother, working through one of those pieces of grief that required being spoken aloud to become manageable, and she had trailed off in the middle and said, "I am sorry. I know I have been through this particular piece before." He said, "You have not this piece." She had looked at him. "You have talked about her letters," he said. "You have talked about finding the box. You have not talked about the piano lessons, about watching her teach children other people's daughters and what that cost her. This piece is new." She had sat with that for a moment, the particular gift of being precisely seen. She had said, "How do you know?" He had said simply, "I listened to you, Theresa." She had had to look away for a moment, out the window at the March landscape. Then she had looked back and said, "I know, that is what I mean." Spring came to the Holloway ranch with a wildness and abundance that she had not expected from the Texas plains. She had imagined the country as austere, and it was, in certain moods and certain lights, but in spring it was something else entirely. The land coming alive with bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush in such quantities that entire fields went purple and orange for weeks, and the sky above was a blue so intense it seemed improbable, and the air smelled of earth and new grass and the river. She stood one morning in early April in the middle of the kitchen garden, which was now properly established and producing with considerable enthusiasm, and looked out at the field of bluebonnets that ran from the edge of the garden to the far fence line and thought, "This is my home," not with the tentativeness of someone claiming a thing that might be taken away, with the flat simplicity of recognition. "This is my home. I live here. This is the place." She told Arthur that evening, and he had looked at her with an expression that was too private for naming, but which she understood and said, "Good." In May of 1879, she discovered she was pregnant. She sat with this knowledge for 2 days before she told him, not because she was afraid of his response, but because she needed the time to become accustomed to the weight of it herself, to integrate this enormous new fact into the structure of her life, to feel it as real. She told him on a Saturday morning, on the porch, in the good spring air. He went very still for a moment, the way he went still when he was receiving something large. Then he turned and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something vast and simple and profoundly open. He said, "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" She said, "I feel fine, a little tired, not unwell." He said, "Good." "That's good." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Theresa, I want to say something, and I want to say it clearly." She waited. He said, "Whatever this becomes, and I hope very much that it becomes everything wonderful, it begins with you, and I am not going to forget that. You are going to come first, before the ranch, before the worry, before everything except itself. You." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "That is exactly the right thing to say." He said, "I have been thinking about what the right things to say are for about 4 years, so I have a head start." She laughed. She laughed out loud in the spring morning air, and he smiled that particular smile of his, the real one, and Dusty Creek lay 2 miles to the west, and the bluebonnets were going off in all their improbable purple, and the world was very large and very specific all at once. The pregnancy was, on the whole, steady. She continued teaching on Tuesdays and Thursdays well into summer, because Clara Bright needed her, and because the work grounded her. She continued the garden. She rode less as the months progressed, which she did not love but accepted as practical. Arthur had quietly, without fanfare, transformed the largest upstairs room into a proper nursery. With a crib he had built himself of cedar wood, and a rocking chair he had found in San Antonio and brought back on the wagon, and a window seat with a view of the plains that she discovered, when she sat in it the first time, was perfect. Mrs. Albright at the boarding house knitted them approximately 12 blankets in a variety of colors, which Theresa received with genuine warmth and displayed on the nursery shelf, in a configuration that looked both cheerful and architectural. In October of 1879, exactly 1 year after Theresa had first walked through the door of the Dusty Creek Sheriff's office with her own face in her hand and fury in her throat, she gave birth to their son. He was born on a cool autumn morning, the kind of morning where the light comes in gold and sideways, in the ranch house bedroom with the Virginia garden painting on the wall, and a doctor from San Antonio who had arrived the previous week and stayed, because Arthur had arranged it with the same meticulous thoroughness he brought to everything that mattered. They named him James after Arthur's father, with Theresa's father's name, Thomas, as a middle name. James Thomas Holloway was born at 7 in the morning and was, from the first moment, loudly confident about his presence in the world. Arthur held him that first morning with a steadiness that she recognized from the way he held everything important, careful and certain and not performing for anyone, just present with it, and looked at his son's face with an expression that was entirely new and entirely right. And Theresa, tired and overwhelmed and more deeply glad than she had known how to be since before grief found her, watched him from the bed and thought, "This is what a family feels like from the inside." James was a vigorous and curious infant who became a vigorous and curious toddler with all of his father's observational thoroughness and all of his mother's directness, a combination that Caleb Wade described, with affectionate alarm, as formidable in a creature that currently came up to his knee. The Holloway Ranch in the years following expanded in the good way, the way a living thing expands when its conditions are right. Arthur brought in better breeding stock and worked with Caleb to improve the water management on the eastern portion of the property, the portion that Frank Tully had tried to acquire, turning it into productive range that had not previously been usable. Theresa's kitchen garden had become, by 1881, a substantial kitchen garden with a greenhouse section for winter growing, and a small orchard of fruit trees she had planted the year after James was born, which would not bear fruit for several more years, but which she had planted with complete faith in the future. She had, over time, taken on a more formal role in the school, which Clara Bright had eventually left in 1880 to marry a rancher from the north of the county. Theresa organized the replacement teacher, a young man named Samuel Pierce from San Antonio who was frightened of the older boys and excellent with the younger children, and she taught reading and literature 3 days a week herself, which Dusty Creek had by then stopped being surprised by because Theresa Kingsley Holloway did not ask permission to be useful. She had opened the tin box again in the spring of 1880. She had sat at the oak table in the morning light with Arthur at his desk in the study, the door open between them, and she had read through the letters a second time, slowly and differently than the first time, with almost 2 years of actual life in Dusty Creek as context. The second reading was very different from the first. The first time she had read them in grief and shock and fury. The second time she read them with something that was not yet forgiveness, but was the ground in which forgiveness might grow, a kind of settled understanding of her mother as a whole person with flawed judgment and genuine love, a woman who had been frightened and had made the wrong choice about what to do with the fear. She had written her mother a letter, which she had not sent anywhere, because there was nowhere to send it, but which she had written anyway and read aloud quietly to herself, and then folded and placed at the bottom of the tin box. She thought she would write more of those letters over time and keep them in the box, an ongoing conversation with a person who was gone. This felt right to her in a way she did not need to explain to anyone. She had told Arthur she was doing this and he had listened and said, "Good, just that," which was exactly right. In 1882, they had a second child. A daughter this time, which Theresa had thought she might prefer, and then discovered she had no preference at all and would have been equally demolished with love either way. They named her Margaret after Theresa's mother, which had required a week of careful thought and a long conversation on the porch in the autumn evening. Arthur had asked, "Are you sure?" Theresa had said, "She was my mother. The name belongs to the love and not to the mistake, and I want Margaret to know where she came from." He had nodded slowly. Then he said, "Margaret Holloway is a good name." "Yes," Theresa said, "it is." Margaret arrived in October of 1882 with a considerable amount of noise and an expression, in her first hour, of extreme skepticism about the entire enterprise, which everyone who saw it said was entirely her mother's expression, which Theresa both denied and found deeply satisfying. James, who was just turned 3, approached the matter of a sister with the seriousness of a very small scientist encountering a new specimen. He spent the better part of Margaret's first week sitting as close to her as he was permitted and watching her with those steady gray eyes that were exactly his father's, as if he were forming a thorough assessment that he would report on when he had sufficient data. By the end of the second week, he had declared her interesting and transferred to her the small carved wooden horse that was his most valued possession, which Arthur observed and Theresa observed, and neither of them commented on to James, because some gifts are most perfect when they are not narrated. By the time Margaret Holloway could walk, she had entirely reversed the power dynamic her brother had established, and James was following her around the ranch with an expression of exasperated admiration that he would carry for the rest of his life. The tin box sat on the study shelf, and Theresa wrote letters to it several times a year, and gradually the sharp edge of the grief and the anger smoothed into something that was simply the truth of her history, which she had learned to carry not as a wound but as a landscape, the ground she stood on rather than the thing that had damaged her standing. She had Arthur to thank for that, in no small part. He had the gift of making things feel permanent in the best sense, not rigid but steady, the way the land itself was steady, the way the ranch was steady. She had grown up without that quality of permanence, moving through a rented life in a rented house, and she had not known how much she had needed it until she had it. One evening in the spring of 1883, she was making supper with Margaret on her hip and James conducting a serious experiment involving a stick and the kitchen floor, and Arthur came in from the range with a letter in his hand and a particular expression on his face. She said, "What is it?" He said, "The Attorney General's office in Austin. The Bellamy and Garrett Water Rights Review is complete. The original acquisitions have been ruled coercive and the properties have been returned." She stood still for a moment, Margaret pressing warm and heavy against her side. Then she said, "How long did that take?" "For years," he said. She thought about Ellen Bellamy, who she had come to know in those years, a woman about 10 years older than herself who had lost access to the water that made her family's farm viable, and had been fighting through lawyers and filings and a system that moved slowly and did not always move toward justice for 4 years. She thought about what those 4 years had cost. She said, "I want to ride over and tell them myself." He said, "I thought you might. I told Caleb we'd be at the Bellamy place tomorrow morning." She looked at him. He said, "You are entirely predictable about justice." She said, "I am not predictable, I am consistent. There is a distinction." "Noted," he said with that real smile. She said, "That is the best news this ranch has had in a long while." He said, "It is." James looked up from his experiment and said, "What ranch?" Both of them looked at their son, 3 years old and already with that particular quality of attention that came at you like a searchlight. Theresa said, "Our ranch. The one you are going to help run when you are old enough." James considered this with appropriate gravity and then returned to the stick experiment, apparently satisfied. Arthur looked at Theresa over their son's head with an expression that contained an entire world's worth of what they had built and were still building, and she looked back at him the same way, and the spring evening came through the kitchen window, golden and specific. The photograph was still in the Bible. She knew this because she had seen him with the Bible in the evenings, the wear on the leather cover, the familiar way he held it, the edges of the pages he had thumbed through so many times. She knew it because she had occasionally, sitting beside him in the evening light, opened the Bible to Psalms and looked at her younger face looking back at her, that 19-year-old self who had sat for the portrait in a St. Louis photographer's studio and not known where the image would go or what weight it would come to carry. She did not feel strange about it anymore. She had felt strange about it for a while, a remnant of the initial shock and the tangled circumstances, but that had dissolved over time into something that was simply part of the texture of the life. It was her face and his faith and the particular shape that their story had made before it became their story, and she had come to believe that the whole of it, the odd angles and the wrong turns and the things done without her consent and the love that had come out of all of that, was simply what the shape of her life was. She was 27 years old. She had a husband who was entirely himself and entirely hers, 2 children who were daily astonishing, a kitchen garden in its 5th year of production, a fruit orchard that was just beginning to yield its first uncertain crop of peaches that were small but extraordinary, a school that she was shaping into something her children and the children of Dusty Creek would carry forward, and a home in the fullest possible sense of the word. Not a building, but a particular configuration of belonging that she had built, deliberately and freely, from the materials available. She had a letter from her mother in a tin box on the study shelf that she could not send and did not need to. She had a man who had looked at her face in a photograph for 3 years and waited, and then when she arrived had waited again, patiently and without pressing, for her to find her own way toward him. In the summer of 1883, Dusty Creek held its 4th of July celebration with the usual combination of genuine patriotic feeling and an excuse for everyone in the county to gather and eat food someone else had cooked. It was a warm, bright day, the kind of Central Texas summer day that starts perfect and builds toward a glory that would be completely unreasonable if you hadn't been watching it all your life. Theresa sat on a quilt in the shade of one of the large live oaks on the town green with Margaret asleep against her side and James, eating an apple with serious concentration. And she watched Arthur across the green, where he was talking with Reverend Marsh and Hector Delgado, and 2 ranchers from the north of the county, talking about water rights and land management, and the price of cattle, the ordinary serious business of this particular place in the world. He caught her looking and held it for a moment across the noise and the motion of the celebration, and something passed between them that had no name but which she had come to understand as the specific signature of their life, the particular quality of being known. She looked down at Margaret's sleeping face, her mother's name worn by a new person, and thought about the tin box and the letters and the long road from St. Louis to this quilt on this green in this town on this bright summer day. And she thought about the photograph still tucked between Psalms and Proverbs in a worn leather Bible, her own face preserved in a man's daily faith, waiting for her to arrive and be real. She had arrived, she was real, she was here. Arthur crossed the green toward her, as she had known he would, and he sat down next to her in the oak shade with Margaret between them and James regarding them both with that steady evaluative look, and he said nothing, which was not because there was nothing to say, but because they had accumulated, over 5 years of a life shared in full daylight and full honesty, enough words to fill the silences easily, and so the silences themselves had become a kind of currency, a comfort rather than an absence. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The town of Dusty Creek moved and celebrated in the summer light around them. 300 people and their children and their animals and their hopes and their ordinary extraordinary lives. And the July sun pressed down warm and specific on the Texas plains. And the Blanco River ran clear and undivided through the eastern range of the Holloway property. And somewhere back at the ranch, the kitchen garden was producing lavishly, and the young peach trees were offering their first improbable fruit. And in the house, on the shelf in the study, The Bible sat with its worn leather cover and its years of use, and inside it, pressed between the Psalms and the Proverbs where he had put it in the spring of 1875, and where it had been ever since, the small tintype photograph of Theresa Kingsley showed a young woman's face, dark-eyed and not yet arrived, but on her way. Nobody in town knew he had kept her photograph inside his worn leather Bible, and perhaps that was exactly right. Perhaps some things belong to the inside of a life, the private architecture of a love built slowly and honestly from strange materials in difficult conditions, and they do not need the town's knowledge to be real. They need only the two people inside the life, who know what the whole of it cost and what it came to, who have held the weight of it between them across years of ordinary mornings and ordinary evenings, and the particular extraordinary thing of two people choosing each other, every day, with full information and explicit will. He had kept her photograph in his Bible, and she had come 400 miles to find her own face waiting for her, and they had taken the wreckage of a secret and built something so solid and so warm and so specifically theirs that it could withstand weather. That was the whole of it. That was everything. She kept her head on his shoulder, and James finished his apple and Margaret slept in the summer heat, and the 4th of July celebration of Dusty Creek. Texas continued around them in all its noise and color and human abundance, and Arthur Holloway held his wife in the shade of the oak tree and thought, as he had thought on perhaps 1,000 evenings since the night he had placed that photograph in the Bible, and understood, quietly, that he was looking at the face of the woman he would love. That some things you wait for are worth every day of the waiting. And some arrivals are so complete that they make the distance that preceded them feel not like loss, but like the necessary shape of how you got here, the particular long road without which you would not be standing now in this specific and irreplaceable place. The summer went on. The peaches ripened. James Thomas Holloway decided that horses were the most interesting things in the world, and began a campaign of strategic positioning near the corral that his father observed with the quiet amusement of a man, recognizing his own approach to things he cared about. Margaret, not yet 2, developed strong opinions about the kitchen garden and would spend long afternoons examining the plants with a seriousness that Theresa recognized as botanical, her own grandfather's Latin naming instinct skipping a generation and arriving new. Theresa wrote another letter to her mother in October, in the anniversary quiet of the month she had arrived in Texas, and she said in it, "I think you knew what you were doing, even if you went about it wrongly. I think you read those letters and you knew he was real, and you believed he was what I needed, and you were not wrong. You were only dishonest, and the dishonesty cost us time that we have since made up in other currency. I am not giving you a free pass, but I am giving you the truth, which is that your daughter is well. Your daughter is happy in the full and earned sense of the word. Your daughter lives in a house with bookshelves and an oak table and a man who reads by firelight, and 2 children who are daily miraculous, and a kitchen garden that has surpassed all reasonable expectations, and she knows exactly where she is and exactly who she chose and exactly how much it is worth. I think that is what you wanted. I think you were right about what I needed and wrong about how to get it, and I have decided that a person can be both." She folded the letter and placed it in the tin box with the others. Then she went back to the main room where Arthur was reading aloud to James from a book about horses, and Margaret was sitting on the rug conducting the same evaluative study of a wooden block that she brought to everything. And she sat down in her chair by the fire and took up her own book and let the evening be exactly what it was. Complete, specific, hers. The worn leather Bible sat on its usual shelf, the photograph inside it where it had always been, and outside the November wind moved across the plains of central Texas, and the fire kept the dark from being lonely, and the Holloway family held its shape against the night, warm and settled and fully, finally, home.